gave it, can Israel as a nation, and when I say nation, like we would say a Cherokee nation, okay? And as a nation, not a nation state necessarily, but can Israel have friends? There seems to be a formality spoken of how Israel interacts with other nations, other peoples. But in the modern sense today, with Torah as the guide, of course, can Israel have friends? Should she, or can she, and if so, should she? And if so, how do we go about that? How do we look at that? Because there does seem to be a formality.
Two things. Israel as a political entity, and this isn't post-1948. This existed from the time of Solomon, right? When Israel existed as one, before it broke up into two kingdoms, they had political affiliations with other countries. Heck, King Solomon had a whole harem and wives based on these political relationships, right? On that basis, Israel could for sure have strong ties, friends, acquaintances, but that's completely a-religious, right? In a religious sense.
In a religious sense, I think is what I'm asking probably.
Right. So in a religious sense, no. In a religious sense, we're not allowed to marry people who don't believe like we do. We're not supposed to really interact with people. We're not supposed to eat their food. We're not supposed to go to their parties unless we're trying to bring them over to our side. Whenever somebody says unity, it's the biggest fake cry out there, because whenever you say unity, we have to ask on whose terms. If we all unite on the side of those who typically cry for unity in the political sphere, that would be aligning on left-wing values. Because if you want to align with the left, but you happen to think right, well, you're breaking the unity. Mm-hmm. Right? So unity is a false term. We tolerate people. It's not that we respect other people's religions. We tolerate other people's religions. Well, the Torah has trained us to think that if you don't behave in an ethical manner, you cannot be part of us, right? And the Torah is that ethical standard. Now, clearly, some people behave ethically in spite of their belief system, but eventually their belief system, their philosophy will end up catching up with them. Even like for those people who think that Jews do not proselytize and we don't really care about influencing the world theologically, the Noahide laws is a form of proselytizing. We're telling you that if we happen to conquer your land, if you don't accept these 7 laws of Noah, we put you to death. Isn't that a form of proselytizing? If we tell you,
warning your enemy before you take their,
right. So instead of offering the Noahide laws, why not offer Judaism? In other words, Judaism does proselytize even today. Jews for Judaism, Tovia Singer, all these guys who are out there destroying people's religions. I admit that I proselytize. I'm talking about people who don't admit that they do it.
No,
right? Those who push the Noahide laws proselytize as much as Asher Meza pushes Judaism, but they just don't preach what they practice. But they preach something else, which only builds resentment later on, because once a person does become this religion and keeps on seeing that their teachers just look down on them, as really someone second class with a relationship their teacher experiences with the Almighty is not good enough for them, that builds resentment, and that's the birth of Christianity. This is why with the Gentiles in the Christian world grew so big that they started persecuting the Torah-keeping Nazarenes of earlier times. So even those who cry for unity, because that's the biggest attack on me, who actively proselytizes, Judaism is not for trying to convince people to believe differently. If you're pushing the Noahide laws, you might as well be proselytizing Judaism. And it's even worse, because once the Gentile actually knows what these laws actually teach, then they're going to begin to hate you, because they're thinking, you're offering me a system that puts me to death for stealing a penny. It says that you're put to death for stealing something worth less than a shova pruta, like a Roman coin. It's like a penny.
Right.
Anyone who's seen the Chabad telethon saying, like we're here to push a universal belief in one God, right? Of course, they're not going to tell you that Chabad is the biggest proponent for labeling Christianity as idolatry amongst the nations, right? But they're not going to tell you that. And they're not going to tell you that according to this system of 7 laws, if you believe in Jesus, if there was a court, you'd be decapitated. Saying this is what the law is.
Right.
So even those who cry for unity are really feeding you a bunch of nonsense.
I say that it speaks about a future that those that are still nations will all come to Israel if they want water on their land. But as in right now, if the Jewish people, I believe if the Orthodox would take over the temple and get cleanse the temple and everything else, is that it'd probably be a long time before Gentiles would be allowed back in.
In terms of the law, I think Gentiles were only allowed up to the Ezra's Nashim, the Hazara, the court. There was a court that Gentiles could walk up to. This whole notion that Gentiles could go through the temple or in the temple or like I said, up to the Ezra's Nashim right before the Hazara. This is nowhere in the Torah, when describing the dimensions of the Mishkan, which ultimately became the Beit HaMikdash, which is just a Mishkan with a stone base. Nowhere is there an inkling that Gentiles were allowed to bring sacrifices. And this is something that many people won't want to mention, that these sacrifices are rabbinic sacrifices. Now, I'm all for Chazal. I'm for the rabbis instituting or the judges instituting practices to keep Israel progressing. Fine. But don't walk around thinking this is sanctioned by God. As a matter of fact, this whole notion that Gentiles could go up to a certain spot was actually invented by King Herod to appease mainly the emperor, who would have sacrifices brought in his behalf. And not that he believed or worshipped the God of Israel, but just like pagans of his time, who had the attitude that if you had an idol, we will worship it. And they cover all their bases by offering sacrifices to many idols on their behalf for wealth, health, all of the above. And even then, they weren't allowed to offer their own sacrifices. The only korban they were allowed to bring was the korban olah, and it was given to the Kohen. He would sacrifice it to him. The priest would sacrifice it for them. So this whole thing of Gentiles in some way traversing through the temple wrapped in a rainbow flag is also a lot of nonsense pushed by these, hippie rabbis who don't know the actual law.
I don't feel bad. That's laughable.
There's a Noahide Talit. You ever seen the Noahide Talit before?
I know some folks who actually went to Jerusalem and offered an idea, and they weren't exactly through. They were. I honestly, if I could put it into a thumbnail description of what I remember, it was flattering, appreciated, not allowed.
It doesn't make any sense. Doesn't make any sense. It's like when you see these plus size mannequins in a convenience store, right?
Right.
And they have the plus size mannequin wearing yoga pants and workout gear. Right? It's kind of like the whole system's broken. Plus size mannequins wearing that gear. Well, so the ideal is to be thin, right? So well, you're asking these rabbis to give you permission to make a talit because the ideal is to be Jewish. Well, anyways,